All right, if people could start finding their seats, I'm going to start introducing our next speaker. If it seems like people aren't coming fast enough, I might speak a little slowly, but if you're in the other room, it's time to start migrating on over. Our next speaker is Whitney Slaten. Whitney Slaten is Associate Professor of Music at Bard College and leads the ethnomusicology curriculum area in the Bard Music program. His research engages jazz studies, music and technology studies, and experimental ethnography and its field methods. A 10-year participation in jazz festivals throughout Harlem amid related observations at New York City concert halls and on Broadway inform Slaten's ethnographic analysis entitled Doing Sound, an ethnography of fidelity, temporality, and labor among live sound engineers. And this is a dissertation that is not a book yet that should absolutely be looked up now rather than waiting for the book to come out. So, and I think it's open access because it's published through Columbia University, so you don't need any login to get that. Doing Sound, you should read it. I read it well. And for people that are writing dissertations, it's a good one to find some inspiration. I did that. His scholarship appears in Current Musicology, Ethnomusicology Review, and Souls. Slaten's recent chapter entitled The Jazz of a Black Ethnographer, a memoir of pedagogy, improvisation, and reflexivity at a liberal arts college, appears in Teaching and Learning Difficult Topics in Music Classroom by University of Michigan Press. He has presented his research at Columbia, MIT, Cornell, and the annual meetings of the Society for Ethnomusicology and the International Musicology Society. His discography as a record producer and recordist include Arthur Bird, Music of the American Harmonium, Artist Wodehouse, This Little Light of Mine, Courtney Bryan, and Creation Story, John Carlos Pereira, a student of James Williams, Don Braden, and Kenny Garrett. Slaten, a saxophonist, featured his own music for the Whitney Slaten Project and regularly performed with Babatunde Alatunji and Clark Terry as a member of the Clark Terry Big Band. This regard for performance, technology, and ethnography guided Slaten's institutionalization of both ethnomusicology and music technology curricula and coursework at Bard, the New School, William Patterson University, and Columbia. His talk today is entitled Misplaced, Jazz, Terroir, and Other Null Hypotheses. Please welcome Whitney Slaten.
Thank you for that, Tom. Just as we've started along, especially Matt, it's difficult for me to not mark the many years I spent at Columbia around this building, the one behind me, and chief among them, perhaps, the chapel, where I did have a chance through the great support of this center to culminate my fieldwork experiences in Harlem, and specifically its jazzmobile festivals that take place in various blocks and parks and sites in the neighborhood, to bring Columbia and the Harlem community together. And I will always remember that event and all the productivity that I think came from it and can continue to come from it. So it's all to say I'm very glad to be here. And I'll just jump right into this in the spirit of time. Ethnomusicology led me to consider the jazz musician and the ethnographer to be similar social actors. They're sharing an aspiration for an improvisatory pursuit of opportunities with people in time, the centrality of technological mediations as the basis for methods, and their dealings with concepts that reveal negotiations with power amidst people's ways of being and knowing, mark likenesses in their moves. The qualitative sociologist Howard Becker, a proponent of participant observation, and a jazz pianist, appreciated these actors in his career that would highlight his adjacencies to and departures from symbolic interactionism. In his book entitled Tricks of the Trade, How to Think About Your Research While You're Doing It, Becker advocates for the researcher's embrace of their own imagery in their work. In particular, he emphasizes a null hypothesis technique or trick that the researcher can use to productively imagine a false project. He characterizes the trick in the following way, quote, "The classic version of the trick is the null hypothesis, which asserts a hypothesis the researcher believes is not true. Proving the null hypothesis wrong proves that something else must be right, though it doesn't tell you what that something else is," end quote. Here, Becker invites social scientists, inclusive of ethnographers, to imagine and reimagine how ethnographers can do this to problematize the artifice of socially constructed labels attached to personhood, as well as the contextual circumstances of that personhood, inclusive of places, could overdetermine the success of their analysis of social facts. If it is true that the jazz musician and ethnographer ever shared acts or aspirations, then how had the jazz musician embraced a null and a place? How have they rendered null hypothetical and hypothetical imagery into sound on bandstands, within clubs, halls, ballrooms, recording and broadcast studios, cities, regions, countries, and many global scapes? How have they done so in the ears and the face of a gazing audience and its insistence that the music comes from an industrially or nationally convenient, perhaps allegedly idyllic place? How has this been grounds for musicians' temporal progressions from struggle to satisfaction, to imbue in sound the fugitivity that poet and philosopher Fred Moten describes as, quote, "a desire for and spirit of escape and transgression of the proper and the proposed, a desire for the outside, for playing or being outside, an outlaw edge, proper to the now always already improper voice or instrument," end quote. How might those who have wielded their voice or instrument almost simply escape the operations of the phrase, quote, "jazz and place," end quote? I offer examples from three musicians whose work spans the Atlantic seaboard of the 20th and 21st century. Beginning with James P. Johnson, I detail how he utilizes the bass line and piano roll technology in his 1918 Carolina Shout, followed by an analysis of the audio dynamic range of compressors in Count Basie's 1955 recording of The Kid from Red Bank. The final example shows Timbaland's use of the shuffle rhythm and reverberation in the audio mix in his 2006 record, Scream. Before discussing these three examples, I draw our attention to the significance of historically pertinent synesthesias that had been foundational to aesthetics in music. Before Guido Adler's 1885 Umfang, Methodie und Ziel der Musikwissenschaft, which called for historical, systematic, and comparative approaches in modern music studies, earlier treatises sought to codify foundational associations between musical sounds and emotional meaning that guided subjective attitudes about beauty in Western art music. Consideration of classical texts guided such treatises within the context of secular early music. The Timaeus, one of Plato's dialogues, especially its sections, The Creation of the World Soul and The Elements, offered Renaissance composers and listeners ideas about consonance and dissonance in music. These sections describe cosmological orientations of earth, air, fire, and water, as well as good and evil, the planets, man, and the demiurge. As a text, the Timaeus, following Pythagorean proportions, depicts an array of cosmological relationships, often conjuring imaginations of certain shapes. The juxtaposition of these shapes to the finite set of musical sounds that they would inspire in the later age reveals an example of how multi-sensuous the foundations of aesthetics in music can be. As such, the Timaeus continues to play a role in constructing cultural expectations of tonal music in spite of the extent to which histories of imperialism, colonialism, and more recent manifestations of globalization significantly mark contemporary Western life. These expansions of power necessitate greater appreciations for different Timeuses that have similarly inspired musical developments that have impacted the civilization. This recalls for me Catherine McKittrick's reflection on the work of Jamaican writer Sylvia Wynter. Quote, Wynter demonstrates the ways in which a new, revalorized perspective emerges from the ex-slave archipelago, and that is worldview engendered both across and outside a colonial frame, holds in it the possibility of undoing and unsettling, not replacing or occupying Western conceptions of what it means to be human, end quote. If the Timaeus is a foundational text for the development of Western European art music, then the Bakongo cosmogram forms a similar foundation for American music. The Bakongo were a people of Southwest Africa during the period of conquest and the transatlantic slave trade. Their ideographic religious symbol or cosmogram, referred to as Nzakongo, appears as a cross within a circle. Art historian Robert Ferris Thompson describes the Bakongo cosmogram, writing, quote, God is imagined at the top, the dead at the bottom, and the water in between. The four discs at the points of the cross stand for the four moments of the sun, and the circumference of a cross, the certainty of reincarnation, especially righteous Congo person will never be destroyed, but will come back in the name or body of progeny, or in the form of an everlasting pool, waterfall, stone, or mountain, end quote. In the Americas, stained by the tragedy of chattel slavery, the cosmogram as a cherished example of African cultural retentions took many forms. One that is central to the development of the music of enslaved Americans and their descendants in the United States is the ring shout. Ring shouts were both embodied in highly spiritual moments of extended repetition and exclamation with musical accompaniment that Africans and their descendants cherished amidst coerced transitions from polytheism or Islam to Protestant Christianity during the period of slavery throughout the Americas. Ring shout practices involve participants shuffling their feet in a counterclockwise circle. Percussive syncopations in their vocal expressions guided these movements. Historian Sterling Stuckey writes that, quote, the repetitive stances of the dancers circled around and around with even greater acceleration reinforced and deepened the spirit of familial attachment, drawing within the ancestral orbit slaves who may not have known either a father or a mother. their involvement being an extension of that of others, the circle symbolizing the unbroken unity of the community. A conversion within the cross, a conversion within the circle of the cross, a movement from one state of being in the Bakongo religious system to a higher one. Substantial numbers of Bakongo, Angolans, and West Coast Africans were enslaved in Virginia, end quote. 20th and 21st century developments of Black popular music in the United States both secularized and aestheticized key aspects of the ring shout, rhythmic syncopation, and other aspects of motion that modern music technologies mediate. Musicologist Sam Floyd Jr. describes the centrality of the ring shout in 20th century early jazz in dialogue with Stuckey. Floyd said, quote, "What Stuckey does not say, but which will be clear to readers familiar with Black culture, is that form, burial ceremonies, the ring, straightened itself to become the second line jazz funerals." I touched Tom to say it's the same quote, but it's good that it's the same quote, I think. Maybe we're onto something. Funerals in which movements of the participants were identical to those of the participants in the ring, even to the point of individual clockwise movements by second line participants. And the dirge to jazz structure of the jazz funeral parallels the walk to shout structure of the ring shout, where the slow and dignified measure of the walk is followed by a double quick tripping measure in the shout, end quote. 20th century Black music pursues a series of tone parallels to the ring shout in ways that show what Floyd describes. What follows are examples of how this practice extends to key expressions of musical improvisation and practices of technological sound reproduction. The concept of the tone parallel is crucial in understanding the ways in which key aspects of sonic, visual, and choreographic features of the ring shout enchant music and technology in American culture. For example, Duke Ellington describes his approach to tone parallels in his autobiography, Music is My Mistress. Quote, "A Negro musician is strongly influenced by the type of music of his time, and the Black beat was his foundation. The music of his time and sound devices were always parallel to the progress of science, medicine, and labor. When you pick the jazz musician of any period, if he happens to be one of the many unique performers, you may be sure he always reflects what's happening in his time." That's Ellington, end quote. Further, literary theorist Brent Edwards adds that, quote, "Parallel has interesting implications for an Ellingtonian understanding of the relation between music and literature in particular, since it offers a metaphor, not a crossing, transfer, or import, much less grafting or mixing, but instead of simultaneous and equivalent movement through space and time. The parallel is staged, in other words, both on the level one might term representational or even interpretive," end quote. Tone parallels inform how I will guide our listening for sounds and or technological reproductions that resemble features of the curvatures of the aforementioned cosmogram, the shuffling feet that outlined its circle in the ring shout, as well as the ways in which parallels inspired assertions of melody, rhythm, and musical dynamics. We first hear an example of James P. Johnson's music, where we should not only listen to the stepwise bass melodic movement in the stride, but a parallel listening to the pertinent technologies that represent them. Next, we will hear an example from Count Basie, where not only are we listening to the melodic, rhythmic, and dynamic manifestations of his swing, but also the ways in which audio compressors affect the attack, decay, sustain, and release of these musical sounds. Finally, in Timbaland, not only should we listen to the shuffle rhythm that very explicitly connects to drumming patterns in jazz, but also his use of reverberation to conjure fabrications of space, sonic space, that suggest cosmological spacings in the relation to the shuffle. James P. Johnson. The consensus among jazz scholars maintains that Carolina's Shout of 1918 was the first jazz piano solo, distinct from earlier forms of ragtime. The Invisible Pianist, according to musicologist David Schiff, and also recognized as the father of the Harlem Stride piano movement, James P. Johnson was the composer of the piece and original performer of its first piano roll recordings. Johnson was born in New Brunswick, New Jersey in 1894 and died in New York City in 1955. Regularly performing and recording piano rolls and sound recordings between Newark, New Jersey and New York City, Johnson eventually moved to the San Juan Hill neighborhood in Harlem, the site of present-day Lincoln Center, where he lived among Hudson River dock workers who migrated north to New York City from the Carolinas and Georgia Sea Islands. Among them, he encountered their remembrances of the musical choreographic features of the ring shout, the cosmological expressive practice that would inform Johnson's innovations of jazz aesthetics. And it also reminded him of his encounters of ring shout expressions during his early childhood in New Jersey. The influence of the ring shout manifests in the pianist's left hand melodic movement, as well as the relationship between the syncopations of the pianist's left and right hand activities. Anthropologists John Swed and Morton Marks wrote that Johnson was very clear on the secular function of the dance as he knew it in the late 19th century, New Brunswick, New Jersey. Johnson said, quote, "The northern towns had a holdover of old southern customs. I'd wake up as a child and hear an old-fashioned ring shout going on downstairs. Somebody would be playing a guitar or Jew's harp and maybe a mandolin, and the dancing went on. The spider and the bed bug had a good time," or Susie. They danced around in a shuffle, and then they would shove a man or a woman into the center of a circle and clap hands, end quote. Johnson's 1918 recording of Carolina Shout, particularly its piano roll, had a profound influence on the pianism of 20th century masters, namely Count Basie and Duke Ellington. The composition, a test piece for every pianist in the tradition to prove their virtuosity, would also figure centrally in the repertoire of his students, as well as the many pianists and other instrumentalists who would perpetuate jazz aesthetics after Johnson's time. In his 1918 piano roll performance of the Carolina Shout, I call your attention to the ways in which the stepwise melodic bass lines move beyond the 1-5-1 of New Orleans ragtime and suggest a tone parallel to the ways shouters circumscribe the ring in both downward and upward movement. The stepwise melodic bass movement that returns to the tonic at the end of musical phrases operates as a tone parallel to the ways in which shouters circumscribe and return to points in the ring. I also take seriously the parallel engagements with acknowledging the circular movements of the piano roll itself. The cylindrical take-up spool that accumulates the paper that runs across the player piano's tracker bar rotates in ways that similarly enact centripetal force that too easily make piano roll performances accelerate in tempo as a technological flaw that is based on the changing diameters of the paper spools. This is a flaw that pianologists work to regulate. However untamed, the player piano shows the potential to accelerate tempo towards the end of the piano roll, and this acceleration resembles continually increasing excitations that shouters would experience. This details moments in which the ring enables the shouts. So this is a maybe rarer rendition that we're not as familiar with. We're mostly familiar with the 1921 piano roll. I tend to prefer the 1918 roll because usually as the plot thickens in the history of piano rolls, there's editing. So there are people who would punch in other holes, not using the recording player piano to perfect the exactitude of a musical idea, versus my sense is that this recording at QRS in Newark maybe did not have the same degree of intervention from editors as the famous one does. So just a chance to share the rarer one, really, though. I mean, you could make claims about both to great predictivity. Anyway, I move now to Count Basie. Born in Red Bank, New Jersey in 1904, William James Count Basie was an important musician of the swing era and leader of the Count Basie Orchestra. The ensemble was active for over 50 years and toured the United States extensively throughout much of that time. These recurring interactions with an array of audiences and musicians in different regions and territories across the country allowed the ensemble to accumulate many different approaches to swing, involving different Southern and Northern conventions in swing performance. A pupil of James P. Johnson's pianism, particularly mediated by Basie learning from Johnson's Carolina Shout piano roll, Basie guided his orchestra to expand, and I mean this as a term of orchestration, to expand the principles of stride piano playing and its legacy steeped in the ring shout to the big band. The stride pianist's left hand expanded to the relationship between the upright bass, guitar, and piano, while the pianist's right hand expanded to the wind and brass section syncopations of riffs and shouts. More than his innovation in dueling solo tenor saxophonist, the Basie sound is most often characterized by expressions within the orchestra's rhythm section. Specifically, Basie's piano style explores strategic assertions of space, a very wide range of musical dynamics that seem to complement the regular interactions between the bass and the guitar. Freddie Green's grassy guitar strums on the quarter notes suggest rural soundscapes that the urban age of brass sections complicate. At times, Basie's light touches that ornament this union also often remind the listener of Johnson's shouts. On and off of the orchestra's notorious busts around the country, riffs and improvised solos negotiate these balances. The post-war period for the band would involve the interpretations of a number of prominent arrangers, the influence of bebop, and the newest developments in audio-technological mediation for recordings and broadcasts. I argue that Basie's perpetuation of these practices of swing negotiated new technologies, particularly those that enacted modes of signal processing that affect musical dynamics. Stride and swing, the ways in which they are parallel motions of shouters in the ring, one might assume that rhythmic syncopation exclusively connects these phenomena. When I performed at the 2003 Bern International Jazz Festival as a member of the Clark Terry Big Band, the Count Basie Orchestra opened for us, and we in turn performed for them in a performance that became the recording Live at Marianne's. Trumpeter Clark Terry remembered playing with Basie and wrote, quote, "Playing with Basie, I felt and heard the music much better than I ever had before. Man, his swing was powerful. Then sometimes it was elegantly dynamic. During his easygoing renditions, there was a soul-stirring feeling. His 4/4 rhythm swayed, a head nodding and ear-bending groove, an easy foot-tapping bounce. Then during his up-tempo renditions, he created a finger-popping force that made you move, unmistakable, undeniable, and very signature," end quote. When we performed for the Count Basie Orchestra, it was very important for us to express the swing tradition in ways that equally attended to the musical dynamics as well as the rhythmic syncopation. The sonic envelope detailing the attack, decay, sustain, and release of musical sounds further intensify the tone paralleling significance of swing's rhythmic syncopation in performance. In the following example, The Kid from Red Bank, from the Basie Orchestra's 1957 album, The Atomic Mr. Basie, recorded at Capitol Studios in New York City, I call your attention to the exchanges between Count Basie's stride piano playing and responses by the horn sections that resemble fragments of what big band musicians refer to as shout choruses. In particular, the modes of technological reproduction that adjust musical dynamics have an effect on the attack, decay, sustain, and release of Basie's piano sound. Transductions by Basie's piano microphone trigger an audio compressor to limit the amplitude of the signal in anticipation of increasing the overall gain of the piano's signal in order for the sounds of the piano to be audible and intelligible within the audio mix that allows the piano to compete with the louder horn sections. For transient instruments like pianos, audio compressors alter the dynamics and temporality of sonic attacks and sustains especially. This in turn affects the listener's perception of the instrument's swing, its rhythmic syncopations. For Basie, the performing artist, a continuum of playing and listening from piece to piece and recording project to recording project makes the human and non-human encounter between the pianist and the audio compressor adjust later generational perpetuations of swing amidst new developments in technology. Acknowledging this, Basie not only swings the piano, but the recording studio itself, as well as the playback technologies of our time and beyond. Such practices that engage both his past and Johnson, as well as our futures, reveals how swing asks for similar cosmological engagements in the ring shout. This recording of The Kid from Red Bank allows us to hear such whispers and shouts and technological mediation. That would be whisper quiet. But that compressor's finding a threshold, affecting what's above it dynamically and raising all of it together to shout while not shouting. Timbaland, Timothy Mosley, otherwise known as Timbaland, is one of the most prominent hip-hop producers of the 20th and 21st centuries. He was born in Norfolk, Virginia in 1972 near Point Comfort, the site in which the first African people were enslaved in the Virginia colony on August 20th, 1619. Timbaland is from the Southern Atlantic state, a descendant of enslaved people, as were the families of both James P. Johnson and Count Basie before they migrated to New Jersey. Timbaland emerges into prominence in the 1990s when regionalism in hip-hop figured prominently in situating, among other features, the musical sounds of different cities and coasts. Dirty South aesthetics associated with Atlanta, Georgia dominated national and international imaginations of Southern hip-hop writ large, rendering marginal the uniquities of the Virginia-based production sounds of Timbaland and his contemporaries, such as the Neptunes. Writer Ben Westhoff observed that, quote, Timbaland seems more blue-collar than Pharrell Williams or Chad Williams of the Neptunes. He can't read music and he hasn't had classical training. Baby coos, birdie tweets, or even ambient noise might serve as a melody, and the resulting sounds are simultaneously disorienting and familiar. His songs are full of empty spaces, where lesser producers might cram in layers of effects to fill silences and coddle their assumedly ADD listeners. He pulls back, end quote. Arguably, Timbaland's oeuvre takes advantage of the marginal position of Virginia in hip-hop in ways that his beats, productions, or accompaniments intentionally express space in silences in ways that are in dialogue, with not only Count Basie and James P. Johnson, but the older cosmological implications of these that animated the ring shout generations prior. Scream, a record on Timbaland's 2006 album Shock Value, features Carrie Hilson and Nicole Scherzinger as vocalists. Timbaland's prominent rhythmic syncopation that lays the foundation of the track very closely aligns with the shuffle rhythm in jazz. The shuffle is a prominent rhythmic feature in organ jazz music and often heard in organ room jazz scenes in settings like Newark and Harlem. The term shuffle, similar to stride and swing, functions as a tone parallel to the movements of earlier shouters' feet. In the sound of the shuffle, one can imagine the slight step of the left foot to be followed by the slight drag of the right foot, as this particular bipedalism outlines the circle of the ring. Prominent and foregrounded as this sound is in Scream, it is connected to an elaborate and ethereal soundscape of a number of synthesized pads that are gently billowing above the interjections of electric guitar countermelodies and the foundations of a bass line. Timbaland's various gradations of reverberation, timing, and shape applied to the signals of each sound source show his meticulous craft in identifying a number of specific spaces in the sound in ways that suggest his participation in cosmological orientations of such dispositions or for the ontologies of these imagined feet and their celestial potentials. As to not be confused by such heavenly aspirations, though, also pronounced by religious associations one makes to the presence of the tambourine in the track. The song's deeply secular texts remind us of James P. Johnson's early forays into secular shouts and are perhaps signified in Hilson and Scherzinger's singing screams instead of shouts. And by way of concluding, I'll say that tracing ring shouts of rhythm and technology contributes to dignified regard for the historical and philosophical foundations of American popular music that indexes African diasporic trajectories both within the United States and the globalized settings it often culturally resounds. In addition, approaches like these that seek to include such foundations to the music of figures such as Johnson, Basie, and Timbaland enhance ethical consideration for just futures in studies of music and culture. My work in this area seeks to align these culturally expressive aspects of Black life in the United States to emergent humanistic and STEM-based discourses that critically assess pertinent academic interdisciplinarity. Thank you.
I think you might have cleared it up, my question at the end. But okay. My question is this. In your view, what is the connection of the ring shouts to the act of improvisation in much of jazz, as well as other art forms such as literature?
Ooh. It's such a well-thought question. I need to try to summarize it for myself. In short, so I'll admit that. You're asking my view of how the ring shout or its legacy manifests in jazz improvisation, as well as improvisation and other assertions across the arts and the humanities. Is that fair? If I
think it's fair, yeah.
Okay.
I'm struggling with the same thing as something I'm feeling.
Okay.
I'm not a musician.
Sure. I would assert that at one introductory level, perhaps, the consideration of the ring shout moves us away from the oft sort of simplistic presumption that improvisation is a willy-nilly sort of ordering of random acts without a purpose or an aim. I think when we get into the broader discussion of the ring shout, as well as the adjacent practices that, as Matt had brought up, bring us to consider the many different ethnic groups of African people in the Americas, right, with specific ways of engaging cosmological practice, that there's specific practices in them, whether it's kumina in Jamaica, whether it's the ring shouts in South Carolina, all kinds of other related practices, including the second line. That it isn't random. That's one thing that the ring shout assures us, that there are steps, processes, the implications of the body to be brought into a sustained, what music theorists would call on the musical side an ostinato, or a set of repeated patterns, to invite incantation, right? You know, so the juxtaposition of the ring shout to other impositive acts yields the question, are we going somewhere? It's usually, that's maybe one elegant way to say it, that we amass our bodies and our orientations, are reckoning with the earth, the ground, to engage certain patterns and repetitions to move beyond that plane. It's one usual point I bring up about this when teaching is that point I made earlier, that, you know, in the big band, we call a certain moment in the form a shout chorus, right? So arrangers, big band, composers of big band music, riffing big bands, territory bands, have a cultural expectation to move towards a moment of excitation, right? So again, there isn't a randomness. This is a legacy of an intentionality to move from one state to another. Emplaced or not emplaced, you know, that sort of thing, yeah.
The only piece that you didn't say anything about is, sorry, the only thing you didn't say anything about is, I mentioned literature.
Oh, literature, oh goodness, well, I am not best suited to delve into a response about literature, although, I mean, now this is, with that marked, I would presume the chance to think about directions and temporalities, or what in physics we would call vectors, right? The idea of narrative, just in the way as jazz solo or horn accompaniment or horn section accompaniment. If I said earlier there's a point, a destination, I would presume that in literature there's, in the making of literature or the analysis of literature, the seeking of different directions and things like this. Perhaps to complicate linear narrative, that the embrace of circles and circular expression would show an alignment to the ways of the ring shout. But that's me now being very outwardly introductory with you, and say that in addition to jazz and literature, there could be several other practices of African retention that make us think about circles phenomenologically, just generally. I think the idea that we're moving away from, the linear progressions hegemonically sort of absorbed into our expectations about what progress is in this particular civilization, that, the ring shout and its growth from the cosmogram and other ancient forms across the African continent, inclusive of Egypt, bring us to consider the phenomenology of shape and encountering different ways of appreciating progression. That's how I would handle that, yeah.
It's a wonderful talk and very illuminating. And I really wanted to respond to brother over here about with the idea of literature.
Yes, please.
In an essay called Remembering Richard Wright, Ellison says that Wright's flaw was that he didn't understand how important shouting in church was. He just didn't have that experience. He said that's what the writer lives for, that moment when the reader is changed forever by a moment that is like a moment of spiritual possession or revelation. And it happens again and again in Invisible Man, where the character says, oh my goodness, those young boys, they could be our savior. So, and it happens in August Wilson at the end of almost every play, where there's a revelation like that. But that idea of narrative vector, and both of them driven by music all the way through. And Joe Turner's Come and Gone, the characters do a ring shout.
Just as you say that, I have to share that Professor O'Mealy had shown me a Bearden piece, or a pair of pieces, of a scene at a river, and one is entitled Baptist, and the other is entitled Sinner, something like that. And it's the same collage, it's the same forms and shapes, it's just that the color is different. Carolina Shout. Well, there you go. I mean, it's Carolina Shout. And to have the same form, same figure, same shapes and everything, but just that one is blue and one is red, extends this to be inclusive of visual arts and things like this, and what cycles and color mean phenomenally, color versus shape, sort of thing. Yeah.
Thanks so much thinking in that talk. I loved hearing. Also, nailing quite a difficult first question. Congrats.
A good
You really
one, though.
you went there.
I need that question.
You went there. I just have a question, in some sense, about technology. If the ring, in addition to being a circle, is a form of communication and dance, participation is what I guess getting at. Could you talked about technology with the compressor and the Basie in a really fascinating, unique way. What about the sort of classic problem of mechanical reproduction, in some sense, breaking the circle, or how do you create a circle? How do you be in the circle with the forms of technological mediation you're talking about with recording or the piano roll?
Right, right. Did you have a turn of phrase that brought up Adorno and Benjamin, or not, did I mishear that?
Yeah.
You did. Okay. Well, this is a matter of culture and difference, I would say. I think what the dialogues between Theodore Adorno and Walter Benjamin opine is exactly what Black life accepts, in that iterations of cycle can change and lose things, right? I think if you had a shouter, a seeker of a ring, in a ring, read these letters back and forth between Adorno and Benjamin, they would say, well, I went here to lose something. There was an aura on me that I didn't want, is maybe what they would, I'm sorry to shout, actually. But these are foundational differences that I think make the point even stronger, right? Right, if reproducibility is the threat to the aura in photography, it was their case, or visual art of some sort. We're dealing in a different setting with a matter of cycles, feedbacks, to think of our friend Novak, or feedback and noises, wanted to sort of rid ourselves of something that is seemingly authentic. If Becker is writing about sociology of deviance, right? Imagine a research participant there pursuing something of a ring shout, to go and shuffle along, to lose something, right? This is this kind of opposite case of the preoccupations of art in the West. I think it's a great question to sort of call our attention to what shouters are doing, I think. think, something like that. Yeah.
I'm not sure I have all the words for this yet, but as I was
I don't
listening
have
to
them
Matt's
either.
question and thinking about that, I also felt like I was hearing something in your paper about the way that the technologies become sort of a participant in this circle, in that I can, see Basie taking on from the piano role,
Yeah.
Johnson plus the technology,
Right.
and then Basie playing back to us. So it's like the technology becomes a
Yeah.
part of the dance or something like that.
Something like that, right, for sure, for sure. It's a great point because it brings me to share what my wonder is about a sort of organological ambivalence, right? That, okay, today it's a piano, but for the future it will be this compressor. It's maybe the way I'm thinking of it in that case. How artificial it is for, the child of slaves to play a piano could be one frame that, many have progressed beyond. But if there's this maybe sort of step back to consider, how betrothed am I to this Western instrument, and why not be inclusive of other instruments? I think makes those sentences like I use about, he's playing many things beyond the piano. So, yeah, I would say that. That's a fantastic question. Thanks. Thank you so much for that. Yep. Yep.
I think we'll move the rest of the questions to the lunch break. Have a
Great.
round of applause for Whitney. Okay, thank you very much to Whitney. Thank you to all of the presenters. Thank you for some wonderful questions that have started to form some through lines that I hope that we can continue to work on in the afternoon session. We're going to try to catch back up to where we are, so that'll make the lunch break a little shorter. So I'm going to try to get us started on around 1:30, but I should say we do have 3 wonderful musicians who are going to play for you. You're not required to sit down and listen quietly, but of course we want to be respectful. And I do want to prompt you to use the opportunity, since we've been talking about this so much, and I like how Whitney got into some of the nitty-gritty about how sound actually works, which is really wonderful. And listen for a moment, at least during these performances, to what the room sounds like. Not just kind of the signal that we might pay attention to more of what the music is, but how the room informs what you hear, and sometimes how the room informs what a musician can do. So these musicians, I've given them, they're professionals, so they know what they're doing. They're also, I don't know if I mentioned this, but students in Columbia's music performance program. But they are going to give you a mix of different kind of formats, like sometimes there'll be some solo saxophone, sometimes there'll be some solo piano. They're going to do some fast, they're going to do some slow. So this might be an opportunity, if you have the time and inclination, to think about how a room might differently affect those various traits of music and other traits of music and being in the world and being in the room that I'm not mentioning. So feel free to grab some food that is provided. We are going to be listening to Dylan Ring on the tenor saxophone, Carl Schultz on the piano, and Maurice Chahur on the guitar. It may take... I'm perfectly willing to give them a couple of minutes to set up, so we don't have to wait with bated breath until they start. But enjoy and let the conversation flow. Thank you.